bad shading will usually be the reason why your paintings suck. Shading is meant to make your 2D drawings feel more 3D, more alive, but it'll just look dirty and muddy if it's not done well. So let me show you what I learned and how I got better at it, so that you can too, if you've been struggling with it. Let's get started. Alright, class is in session. Pay attention. I'll go over all the steps I took to go from not being able to shade anything to being able to shade like this without too much struggle. It didn't happen overnight though, and my first step was probably the same as most. I started by copying other artists. Probably my biggest inspiration, even though it's not technically the best, were the early Blizzard games booklets that came with their games. You know, I drew so many characters from the Warcraft 2 concept, probably all of them, trying to make them as one-to-one as possible. Back then, I was only drawing with pencils, so shading seemed like the natural way, you know, to go beyond a simple line drawing. Colors were not yet on my radar. Over the years, I also started using real photos as reference to copy from too. There was so much to learn from copying, but it felt like I was missing something. It's when I read a book about simplification though, and I forgot the name of the book, so don't ask, but everything clicked for me at that point. With copying, I could get things to look pretty decent, you know, like decent enough with hours thrown at a drawing, but I didn't understand why my drawings from imagination sucked so bad when I wasn't copying. Understanding simplification changed everything. What simplification is the ability an artist has to ignore details from a reference. To look at a leg, for example, you know, with all its anatomy and details, and be able to simplify it down to its simplest volume. A leg in this case could be simplified down to a cylinder. The head, a simple sphere maybe, or an egg shape. Basically, I went from seeing this when looking at a character reference, what most people see, to this. When the details are abstracted out, simplified, shading starts to make a lot more sense. A real leg like this again might look pretty daunting to shade because it's so complex, but when it's just a cylinder, well, we can just darken the edges a little bit and right away it looks like a cylinder. A 3D volume, much easier. And then when we overlay this on top of the leg, of course it's missing a few details, but that shading is already somewhat convincing. So that should always be the first pass when you shade your drawings, if this is hard. Have a look at your character, creature, whatever it is you're drawing, and simplify everything like this to get a structure of simple volumes. That was my biggest realization, even though in hindsight it seems so obvious. Hopefully that makes sense for large details, but what about all those details that we've been ignoring when shading those simple volumes, like medium-sized details, smaller details? Well, all of those are just smaller, simple volumes, you know? I would approach them exactly the same way. So as you get better at art, you should stop looking at your references as a normal person. You gotta put on your artist goggles. Observe things that you need out of your reference. Ignore the rest. That selective observation skill is key. I quit to start my business in 2016, but the 10 years prior to that, I was a 3D character artist in the video game industry, so I had quite my share of 3D sculpts to look at, rotate around, and observe under different light sources. I think that really contributed to helping me level up my shading skills. All through observation, really. Cool story, bro, but how does someone not in that very specific situation still learn that stuff? Well, thankfully there's a lot of 3D models that you can use for free to do the exact same thing. I still do it myself if I need a very specific reference that I can't imagine for some reason. I'll go on something like Sketchfab, which has a lot of models that you can interact with, or I often mention 3D Poser Web, which is also great since you can pose the character exactly how you want and adjust the light direction. If you're not using those resources, you should. There's something in the brain that unlocks when you start to really observe and think in terms of volumes in 3D instead of 2D shapes only. I can't really explain it any other way. It's kind of like flipping a switch, and then shading just starts to make much more sense after that. And there are many more switches like that in art, all of which I think I can help with when you join my complete art education program, Art School for Digital Artists. This month is actually the 7th anniversary of the program, so 7 years ago I started to work on it, and to celebrate the milestone, I'm launching a massive sale starting now until the end of the month. So check the link in the video description to find more and join a community of over 22,000 artists already enrolled. It's the project that I'm most proud of in my life, and heck, I'm still working on updates 7 years later. It's the purchase that just keeps on giving, and I don't want you to miss out on the deal, so check it out, link down below. Alright, plug over, back to shading. Now there are a couple other things I've observed over the years, like most other experienced artists I'm sure, that make a big difference when shading. So let's go over those real quick as I wrap up my new painting in the background. One is the proper use of values. Obviously, lighter values represent light, and darker values the absence of light. Darkness. That's pretty basic. But what's not as obvious, it seems, based on all the students that I've mentored over the years, is that values have a range. It's not just black and white. Good shading usually uses the full range of values this way. And if you pull up the levels tab in your painting software of choice, you should be able to see a little bit of black and white used at the extremities, but most of the values should be grouped towards the center of the curve. And just to be clear here, how high the curve is the amount of that specific value, right? So there's more gray in the middle than there are pure whites and pure blacks. This is kind of a foolproof way to make sure that your values are not too high contrast or too low contrast, or maybe too dark overall or too bright. If you look at your shading and you feel like something is kind of off, but you can't really put your finger on it, the levels curve is often able to tell you why. I will say though, the two most common mistakes that I see from students are values that are too dark, where the top of the curve will be all the way to the left instead of being centered, or values that are just too high contrast, where the curve will be kind of reversed, not enough gray in the middle. So to be safe, just avoid those situations, unless you know exactly what you're doing and have a specific idea in mind, of course. And now let's talk shadows. So there are two main kinds that you should be thinking about when shading. The first type of shadow will be a cast shadow. Basically, when you have something blocking the light from reaching another surface. So like when you're outside and you can see your shadow on the ground. Your body, is blocking the light from reaching the ground. Those are the hardest to paint from imagination, so make sure you always use a reference like Magic Poser Web I've mentioned to practice. One trick that's been a big help figuring out what the cast shadow might be is to imagine that you are the light source. So if your light source is the sun, for example, like it is for me here, I'll try to imagine that I'm where the sun is, floating in the sky, looking down at my scene. From up here, I should be able to see the top of the head of my character, the top of the shoulders, part of the waist, etc. It's a strange mental exercise to do, but once again, it gets much easier the more you observe 3D objects and play with light sources, using something again like 3D Poser Web. More simply though, you can just keep in mind the umbrella effect. So whenever something big is directly above something else, it'll block some of the light, so anything below should have darker values. Kind of oversimplified, but it works pretty well in most cases. If all of this is brand new to you, that should already take you pretty far. Oh, and cast shadows have a specific shape too, the shape of the object blocking the light. Now, the second type of shadow, and we'll end it there, are proximity shadows. In the 3D world, we call that ambient occlusion, but it's basically how two or more objects that are close enough together will start to block the light from each other, hence proximity shadows. Those types of shadows won't have a specific shape on the other hand, and the closer the objects, the darker the shadow tends to get. And you can actually test this right now with your hands. So just bring your hands together like you're clapping or like praying to the gods of art or something, and notice the dark crevice in between your hands. It goes away as you take your hands apart. This will happen practically all the time when objects interact. Like you can see how the values get darker around the sash here, or in between her neck and her hair. Proximity shadows are everywhere, and this type of shadow will usually need darker values, since the deeper the crevice or the closer the two objects are, the less light is able to escape from there, which we see as dark. So to recap, cast shadows take the shape of a somewhat distant object blocking the light, while proximity shadows are a result of objects getting so close to each other that they block light from each other. That's not always going to be true, of course, but it's true most of the time, so it's a great guideline to keep in mind. And well, that is going to be the end of this class. Now, go out there and shade some stuff. I hope that was helpful. You know what to do if it was. Also, since you've been a good student, you get freebies. If you haven't already, you can go ahead and grab my free custom brush bag that's available for download with the link in the video description. It's full of brushes that I use all the time, full of my favorites. So even though it's free, it's not some trash, it's brushes that I use all the time. And then there you'll also find a link to some exercise files with a bunch of drawings that you can practice shading if that helps. And also don't forget, I have a huge discount on my